Some family invitations are meant to keep you out of sight. My brother texted that I could attend his engagement dinner, provided I never introduced myself as his sister to the father of his future bride, a federal judge. Graham does not realize the man he is desperately trying to impress already knows exactly who I am. He also does not know I am about to spot a name tonight that will completely destroy his fraudulent future. My name is Aaron Hardy, and I am 37 years old. At 9 o'clock on a Thursday evening, the Office of Civic Contracts Oversight is a cavern of fluorescent light and oppressive silence. Most people leave this building exactly at 5 o'clock, eager to escape the suffocating weight of government bureaucracy. I have always preferred the quiet hours. My department is the one nobody likes to talk about at elegant cocktail parties. We are the auditors, the investigators, the people who stubbornly pull the loose thread on massive public contracts until the expensive suits of shady developers completely unravel. It is tedious, punishing work, but it is honest. Honesty, however, has never been a currency my family knows how to spend. My phone vibrated against the cheap wood veneer of my desk, shattering the quiet of the empty floor. The screen lit up with a new message from my older brother, Graham. I stared at the notification for a long moment before picking the device up. Graham rarely initiated contact unless he needed a mess fixed, a bill quietly paid, or an inconvenient truth swept neatly under a rug. Tonight, the message was an invitation, though it was structured far more like a restrictive non-disclosure agreement. He wrote that I was still permitted to attend the rehearsal dinner tomorrow night. It was the highly anticipated meeting of the two families before his lavish wedding. But there was a non-negotiable condition, stated with the kind of brutal politeness Graham had spent years perfecting at his elite image consulting firm. He demanded that I absolutely not introduce myself as his sister. Instead, if anyone in the room happened to ask, I was to smile politely and state that I was merely a longtime family acquaintance. His reasoning was laid out in crisp, sterile text. His fiancée's father was a highly respected federal judge. The guest list was heavily curated. According to Graham, having an estranged sibling with a tedious government oversight job floating around the room would disrupt the carefully crafted narrative he was trying to sell. He needed everything to be, using his exact word, tidy, a family acquaintance. I read the words a second time, feeling a familiar, hollow ache bloom wide and deep in my chest. It was a clean, surgical removal of my existence from his life. Before I could even set the phone face down, it rang. The caller ID flashed with the name of my mother, Diane. She always operated as Graham's dedicated cleanup crew, stepping in immediately to soften his blows with a thick layer of maternal manipulation. I answered the call, pressing the phone tightly to my ear without saying a single word. Her voice flowed through the speaker, dripping with that forced, sugary warmth she reserved specifically for difficult conversations. She immediately launched into a monologue about how glad she was that Graham had reached out, insisting that they both desperately wanted me there. But then came the specific instructions, delivered as casually as if she were suggesting a color scheme for floral arrangements. She told me they had arranged a lovely little table for me near the heavy glass patio doors. It was a side table, pushed far away from the center of the magnificent dining room, safely distanced from the judge, and completely isolated from the main family seating. She suggested that I keep to myself, enjoy the catered food, and please, for the absolute sake of the evening, avoid talking about my job. She claimed my work was simply too serious, and she did not want me making the celebratory atmosphere heavy. I listened to her take a shallow breath on the other end of the line, waiting patiently for me to capitulate, to easily fold myself into the shape of the good, invisible daughter I had always been conditioned to be. This was not a new dynamic. It was the foundational operating principle of the Hardy household. Growing up, Graham was the ultimate project. He was the golden boy, the charismatic investment they poured every ounce of their resources and fragile pride into. He was meant to be put on display. I was the background machinery, expected to manage myself, ask for absolutely nothing, and step quietly aside whenever the spotlight swung his way. I gave my mother a brief, non-committal reply and abruptly ended the call. The heavy silence of the office rushed back in, but the air felt entirely different now. It felt thick with the residue of their calculated shame. I picked up my phone once again to reread Graham's text, searching for anything I might have missed. There was a strange addendum near the bottom, a specific detail I had initially skimmed over. He explicitly warned me not to wear my agency identification badge. Furthermore, he strictly instructed me to feign complete ignorance if I happened to recognize anyone from local legal or civic oversight circles in the room. That bizarre demand snagged hard on my professional instinct. Graham was an arrogant snob, certainly, but he was a deeply calculated one. He would not care about a cheap piece of plastic identification unless that specific card represented a legitimate threat to him. He would not care if I recognized a prominent lawyer or city official unless he was absolutely terrified that the official might recognize me first. My presence at this dinner was no longer just an aesthetic problem. It was a severe logistical risk. I immediately opened my secure work email and searched for the contact information for the event coordinator handling the dinner. Earlier that same week, she had sent out a generic dietary restriction form. I drafted a swift reply, citing a sudden and severe food allergy, and formally requested to see the final seating chart and the complete guest list to ensure there would be no dangerous cross-contamination at my assigned table near the patio. The coordinator, eager to avoid a medical emergency, sent the requested document over in less than 5 minutes. I opened the attached spreadsheet and expanded the columns. I scrolled rapidly past the familiar names of distant relatives and local politicians. Then, my eyes locked onto a name positioned prominently near the top of the exclusive VIP table list, Rowan Vale. The controlled air in my office suddenly felt freezing cold. Rowan Vale was not a casual family friend. He was a ruthless urban developer, a man whose corporate entities moved staggering sums of money through vital civic infrastructure projects. More importantly, he was the primary target of a sprawling, deeply buried audit file sitting secured on my hard drive not 3 feet away. For 6 agonizing months, I had been obsessively tracking his ghost networks, dissecting the elaborate shell companies he utilized to artificially inflate prices on public technology and security upgrades. He was a man who routinely bought influence, and I was the exact person methodically building the ironclad case required to tear his fraudulent empire completely apart. Graham was not simply ashamed of my modest government salary. He was terrified of my jurisdiction. My brother, who made his lucrative living polishing the tarnished reputations of the wealthy and corrupt, was intimately connected to Rowan Vale. And he was actively using this wedding, and the immense judicial prestige of his future father-in-law, as a glamorous stage to solidify that dark connection. They wanted me relegated to the tiny table near the patio doors. They desperately wanted me to swallow my own name, hide my credentials, and sit silently while I watched them play their high-stakes game of pretend. A quiet, suffocating rage settled deep into my bones, entirely replacing the initial sting of family rejection. It was a cold, precise, and utterly professional anger. I replied to Graham's text message with a single word confirming my attendance. I would go to the dinner. I would not go because I was passively willing to endure their calculated humiliation, or because I still craved their conditional scraps of affection. I would go because my arrogant brother had vastly underestimated the very woman he was trying so hard to erase. He genuinely thought he was pushing a weak, subservient sister into the dark shadows. He did not realize he had just personally invited the lead auditor investigating his most dangerous associate right into the center of his fraudulent world. I systematically shut down my computer, grabbed my heavy coat, and walked out of the office, ready to take my assigned seat in the dark. I did not build my career on country club handshakes or whispered introductions in mahogany dining rooms. My foundation was constructed from academic scholarships, grueling graveyard shifts, and the quiet, solitary ability to spot the deliberate lies hidden within seemingly innocent columns of numbers. While others networked and exchanged favors, I studied the anatomy of municipal deceit. Over the years, I had cultivated a specific reputation at the oversight agency. I was the person they assigned when a case required someone immune to intimidation and completely deaf to political pressure. My specialty was unspooling the elaborate networks of shell companies. These were the phantom subcontractors that wealthy developers invented to artificially inflate the cost of public technology infrastructure. They would route invoices through 3 different fake logistics firms registered to empty strip malls before charging the government double the market rate for basic security cables. The current file dominating my desk was a sprawling, complicated beast. It centered on a comprehensive security and data infrastructure upgrade package designated for several vital federal buildings across the district. It was a project vast enough to generate its own gravitational pull. It attracted a relentless swarm of white-collar defense attorneys, aggressive campaign donors, velvet-tongued lobbyists, and the specific breed of opportunists who made their fortunes simply by standing adjacent to real power. The budget was immense, running well over $200 million of taxpayer money. In civic projects of that staggering scale, a discrepancy of 2 or 3% could easily vanish into the bureaucratic ether. That small percentage represented millions of dollars quietly lining the pockets of men who already owned vacation homes and private equity portfolios. I was the auditor systematically tracking those missing percentages down to the absolute last decimal point. My name might have been considered a tedious liability by my own mother, but in certain austere circles of the capital, it carried significant, undeniable weight. 2 years prior, I had authored a comprehensive risk analysis memorandum. The document detailed the exact modern methodologies corrupt civic contractors used to compromise municipal bids and bypass federal oversight protocols. It was a dry, highly technical document, completely devoid of dramatic flair, but it was rigorously and undeniably accurate. The agency leadership had quietly adopted it as a standard reference. Within 6 months, that specific document had been integrated into the mandatory judicial ethics training programs for federal appointees across the Eastern Seaboard. Men and women who wore heavy black robes, individuals who held the absolute power to alter lives and shatter corporations, read my words to understand how modern, sophisticated bribery truly functioned. My family treated me like a faded stain on their pristine social upholstery, completely oblivious to the fact that the very people they desperately wanted to impress viewed me as a structural pillar of institutional integrity. The stark contrast between Graham and myself was not just a matter of conflicting personalities. It was a profound divergence in our fundamental values and our relationship to reality. Graham was a senior associate at Fenwick Meridian Strategies, a high-gloss image consulting firm that specialized in laundering the reputations of wealthy men who had made ugly public mistakes. He lived entirely on favors, strategic golf games, and the constant, exhausting need to be perceived as important by the ruling class. He required a room to validate his existence the exact moment he walked into it. I lived in a minimalist, sparsely furnished apartment, drove a sensible 10-year-old sedan, and kept my private life entirely guarded. I did not need an audience or an invitation to know my own worth. This toxic dynamic was deeply rooted in our shared history. 7 years ago, my parents had nearly lost the family home due to a catastrophic failure to pay their property taxes for 3 consecutive years. The county was exactly 14 days away from initiating formal foreclosure proceedings and evicting them. The debt was staggering, hovering near $60,000, inflated by severe penalties and aggressively mounting interest. My parents were paralyzed by panic and suffocating shame, unable to even open the Daily Mail. I did not offer empty platitudes or performative sympathy. I quietly liquidated my modest retirement fund, taking a massive financial penalty in the process. I took on a second contract job performing tedious data entry for a medical billing company late into the night. I negotiated directly with the ruthless county revenue department to structure a final, binding settlement. I saved the house. I asked for no parade and expected absolutely no gratitude. Yet, 6 months later, when Graham secured his lucrative junior partner position and handed my father a cashier's check for $5,000 to help with the remaining winter utility bills, the family narrative was permanently and violently rewritten. Graham was instantly canonized as the savior. He was the loyal, successful son who carried the heavy, noble burden of the family on his broad shoulders. I simply went back to being the difficult, abrasive daughter who worked too much and smiled too little. I never corrected their delusions. The absolute truth was my private armor, and I wore it silently. Now, sitting in the harsh morning light of my apartment hours before the rehearsal dinner, I reviewed the guest list again. The presence of Rowan Vale was a glaring, flashing warning light. He was not a man who attended social functions out of mere politeness or familial duty. If he was taking the valuable time to break bread with a federal judge and a public relations executive, it was a highly calculated transaction. He was the missing link I had been aggressively searching for. For months, I had strongly suspected that the inflated federal upgrade contracts were being smoothed over by an influential third party. I knew there had to be someone who could bridge the dangerous gap between raw, dirty money, prime real estate, and the pristine influence of the courts. Vale was that bridge. Graham was not merely throwing a lavish wedding to celebrate his romance. He was hosting a high-stakes corporate merger under the false guise of holy matrimony. I opened my encrypted work laptop. The rules of my chosen profession were absolute, and I adhered to them with religious devotion. I brought up my official agency schedule and initiated the strict internal protocols for declaring a potential conflict of interest. I meticulously documented the impending social interaction with Rowan Vale, noting his exact status as the primary subject of my active federal investigation. I detailed the specific nature of the event and the familial relationship connecting the attendees. I was building an impenetrable firewall around my own professional integrity. Then, I took a digital screenshot of the text message Graham had sent me the night before. I captured the exact words demanding I hide my identity and my agency affiliation from the judge. I attached it directly to the official disclosure file. I did not save it as a painful, sentimental reminder of my brother's cruelty. I archived it as a critical piece of material evidence. His specific instruction to conceal my professional jurisdiction from a federal judge was no longer a petty sibling insult. It was a documented attempt to manipulate an environment where a target of a federal audit was actively courting a prominent member of the judiciary. I closed the laptop and listened to the firm click of the security latch. The dull, familiar ache of family rejection had completely evaporated from my system. It was entirely replaced by the cold, sharp clarity of a seasoned investigator who has finally cornered their prey. If the carefully constructed facade cracked tonight, it would not merely be an embarrassing family dispute over a misplaced seating arrangement. It would be a catastrophic fracture in a multi-million-dollar system of corruption that someone was desperately trying to legitimize. I walked calmly toward my closet to select a dress for the evening. It would be something simple, unmemorable, and perfectly suited for a woman assigned to a dark corner near the patio. They desperately wanted me to be invisible. I would give them exactly what they asked for, right up until the precise moment I decided to burn their entire fraudulent stage to the ground. The Belmere Society House in Georgetown was a fortress of exclusionary privilege. It was the kind of establishment where generational wealth was whispered into expensive cocktails, never shouted over the elegant string quartet playing softly in the far corner of the room. Arriving at exactly 7 o'clock in the evening, I found the historic venue entirely suffocating. The dark mahogany hardwood floors gleamed with a predatory polish, reflecting the heavy crystal chandeliers suspended from the vaulted ceiling. Every single surface, from the silver cutlery to the stiff linen napkins, was so immaculately maintained that any moral failure brought into the room would instantly stand out like a deep, jagged scratch across a pane of flawless glass. I handed my inexpensive, utilitarian winter coat to a uniformed attendant and stepped into the grand foyer, feeling the immediate, dropping weight of the atmosphere. Graham intercepted me before I could even take a full breath of the expensive, overwhelming floral arrangements banking the entrance. His smile was painfully tight, a rigid, desperate grimace masking deep-seated panic. He did not offer a hug or a warm greeting. Instead, his eyes darted over my posture, performing a rapid, merciless visual inspection from the modest collar of my dark navy dress down to the scuffed toes of my sensible leather heels. He was aggressively assessing my threat level, calculating exactly how easily I could be concealed within the overwhelming opulence he was desperately trying to claim as his own territory. "You made it," he murmured, his voice pitched perfectly low to avoid carrying over the ambient chatter. Before I could offer a neutral response, he clamped a heavy hand firmly onto my left elbow, steering me forcefully toward a striking woman draped in pale, expensive silk. Lila Whitcomb possessed the effortless, untroubled beauty of someone who had never once in her entire life worried about a late utility bill or a negative bank balance. "Lila, darling," Graham purred, his entire physical posture softening instantly into the meticulously rehearsed performance of a devoted, loving partner. "This is Erin." I mentioned she was stopping by. Lila extended a perfectly manicured hand, her smile warm but politely vacant. "It is so incredibly lovely to finally meet you. Graham has mentioned you work in government?" I opened my mouth to respond, but Graham seamlessly cut me off, his grip tightening imperceptibly, sending a sharp throb of warning into my arm. "Erin occasionally helps out with some basic compliance paperwork for various local community projects," he lied smoothly, his tone dripping with a suffocating, patronizing affection. "Nothing too glamorous, and it is mostly administrative, but it keeps her very busy." The reduction was breathtaking in its sheer efficiency. He took a highly respected career in federal oversight and violently shrank it down to the equivalent of filing local volunteer forms. I did not flinch, nor did I correct him. I let my hand drop gracefully from Lila's warm grasp and offered a tight, perfectly calibrated nod, allowing the silence to hang just long enough to be slightly uncomfortable before Graham rushed to fill it. With Lila quickly distracted by an approaching waiter carrying a heavy silver tray of vintage champagne, my brother immediately pivoted me away from the bright center of the room. As we navigated the bustling periphery, we encountered small clusters of elegantly dressed guests. To them, he did not even grant me the meager dignity of a falsified administrative career. "A longtime family acquaintance," he announced casually to a pair of wealthy venture capitalists, entirely erasing our shared bloodline with 5 careless, devastating words. He finally deposited me at a small, circular table pushed flush against the heavy glass patio doors. It was a profound geographic insult. This was the designated overflow zone, a humiliating purgatory reserved exclusively for junior assistants, uninteresting secondary dates, and the specific people deemed far too socially irrelevant to occupy the grand main dining area. The physical placement was an act of soft, brutal violence entirely common to this specific social class. They did not scream or throw things. They simply arranged the furniture to silently inform you of your utter worthlessness. The cold draft from the winter air seeped right through the thin glass and directly into my bones, a constant, physical reminder of my orchestrated exclusion. From my marginalized vantage point at the very edge of the room, I possessed a perfect, unobstructed view of the elaborate stage my brother had constructed. Across the dining hall, my mother, Diane, held court near the towering display of imported hors d'oeuvres. She caught my eye for a fraction of a second, flashed a brilliantly fake, wide-toothed smile, as if my placement near the freezing exit was a delightful, accidental coincidence, and immediately turned her back to me. My father, Robert, was nursing a glass of dark amber liquor near the massive stone fireplace. He pointedly kept his gaze fixed firmly on the dancing flames, his shoulders hunched forward in a posture of profound, pathetic cowardice. He knew exactly what was happening to his daughter, and he lacked the fundamental spine to look me in the eye while I was being actively erased from the family narrative. Graham, meanwhile, was in his absolute, undeniable element. He glided effortlessly from group to group, laughing at the exact right moments, clapping powerful older men familiarly on the shoulder, wearing the expensive tailored suit of a man stepping seamlessly into an aristocratic lineage. Then, cutting through the crowd of polished socialites, I spotted him. Rowan Vale was standing casually near the center of the room, sipping sparkling water with the serene, untouchable detachment of a reigning monarch. Watching him in a purely social setting was a terrifying masterclass in predatory camouflage. He possessed a terrifyingly calm, slick demeanor. He looked exactly like a man who never directly signed a compromising financial document with his own hand, yet whose distinct foul scent permeated every corrupt municipal contract in the entire district. His dark suit was impeccable, his posture completely relaxed. He was casually chatting with a senior partner from a prominent lobbying firm, looking utterly unbothered by the massive trail of phantom invoices and shell companies he left in his wake. Seeing him breathing the same rarefied air as my treacherous brother solidified a cold, hard knot of absolute purpose deep in my stomach. Suddenly, the low, steady hum of polite conversation dipped noticeably. It was a subtle but undeniable atmospheric shift, like the sudden drop in barometric pressure right before a violent storm breaks. Judge Martin Whitcomb had arrived. Lila's father was the very last person to enter the grand dining hall. He was not a loud or physically imposing man. He did not wear flashy luxury watches or demand immediate attention. Yet, the entire room immediately and automatically reoriented itself to orbit around his immense, invisible gravitational pull of power. He possessed the quiet, terrifying stillness of a man who held the ultimate, unchecked authority to dictate the futures of every single person present in the building. He exchanged brief, measured handshakes as he walked through the crowd, his facial expression entirely neutral, his sharp eyes absorbing every microscopic detail of the extravagant gathering. Graham practically vibrated with eager, pathetic anticipation, rushing forward to warmly greet his future father-in-law. Judge Whitcomb accepted the effusive greeting with a polite, brief nod, but his focused attention was already sweeping directly past my brother's eager, smiling face. The judge systematically scanned the massive room, instantly categorizing the guests, observing the rigid social hierarchy Graham had meticulously laid out across the floor plan. His gaze swept over the local politicians, the wealthy real estate developers, the fawning members of my own family, and then, his eyes landed heavily on the small, isolated table pushed against the patio doors. His gaze locked directly onto mine. The polite convention of a casual, high society glance dictated that he should look away after a mere fraction of a second. He did not look away. Judge Martin Whitcomb stopped entirely in his tracks. The ambient noise of the crowded room seemed to completely mute itself in my ears. He stared at me for 3, 4, 5 impossibly long seconds. It was a deeply analytical, piercing gaze, his thick brow furrowing slightly. I recognized that specific, heavy expression immediately. It was not the vague look of a wealthy host wondering who the stranger sitting in the dark corner was. It was the sharp, calculating look of a seasoned legal mind actively connecting a physical face to a distinct, highly respected professional memory. I did not avert my eyes or shrink back into the shadows. I held his intense gaze with the flat, unblinking, terrifying calm of a seasoned auditor staring down a hostile, squirming witness. Eventually, the judge offered a very slow, barely perceptible nod of acknowledgement before smoothly turning his attention back to his smiling daughter. I sat back quietly in my chair, the cold winter draft from the glass completely forgotten. I finally understood the full, terrifying scope of my brother's desperate strategy. Graham was not merely attempting to control how I appeared to these wealthy people. He was actively trying to control who in this room was legally permitted to understand my true identity. He was frantically building a massive wall of fiction to keep the powerful judge and the corrupt developer separated from the oversight official sitting quietly in their very midst. My brother genuinely thought he was playing a brilliant, flawless game of high society chess. He had absolutely no idea that I was simply waiting for the perfect moment to calmly reach out and flip the entire board. The delicate chiming of a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute cut through the low murmur of the dining room at exactly 8:30 in the evening. The extravagant main courses had been cleared away by a small army of silent servers, leaving the air heavy with the scent of roasted meats and expensive perfumes. At the center of the grand head table, Graham rose to his feet. He buttoned his tailored jacket with a practiced, fluid motion, radiating the polished confidence of a man who firmly believed he had successfully orchestrated the entire universe to his exact liking. He began his opening toast. His voice was smooth, resonant, and entirely stripped of any genuine emotion. It was a masterclass in corporate public relations disguised as heartfelt sentiment. For the first 5 minutes, he spoke eloquently about love, duty, and the sacred merging of two distinct legacies. He looked deeply into Lila's eyes, offering her a smile that looked perfectly manufactured for a luxury lifestyle magazine. But then, as he predictably always did, Graham expanded his focus to encompass the broader room, turning his own engagement into a testament to his own impeccable character. He spoke of the future, emphasizing the profound importance of honor in both personal and professional endeavors. He talked about the rare privilege of being trusted by truly decent, influential people. His eyes lingering briefly on Rowan Vale before shifting toward Judge Whitcomb. It was a sickening performance. He was actively using the vocabulary of integrity to construct a fortress around his own deceit. Then, in a move of staggering arrogance, he decided to incorporate me into his grand narrative. He needed to explain my presence in a way that neutralized any potential questions, turning me from a marginalized family member into a useful prop for his own humility. He gestured vaguely toward the dimly lit periphery of the room where I sat entirely still. He adopted a tone of benevolent condescension. He told the assembled crowd that building a successful life required many different kinds of people. He smoothly explained that some individuals were destined to lead from the front, to shoulder the heavy burdens of public leadership and vision. But others, he noted with a patronizing tilt of his head, preferred to dwell in the background. He explicitly referred to me as an acquaintance who handled the small, necessary, invisible tasks. He painted me as a minor bureaucratic drone, someone who quietly pushed paper so that the truly important people in the room could change the world. He was attempting to make me incredibly small, so his own shadow would appear massive on the wall behind him. He paused, waiting for the polite, appreciative laughter and the gentle clinking of glasses that usually followed his carefully timed displays of false modesty. The laughter never came. Instead, the heavy silence was shattered by a single, commanding voice from the head table. "Excuse me," Judge Martin Whitcomb said. He did not raise his voice, nor did he tap his glass. He simply spoke, and the entire room instantly stopped breathing. The judge placed his linen napkin neatly beside his plate and leaned forward, his sharp gaze cutting directly past Graham's frozen, smiling face. He aimed his attention entirely at the dark corner by the patio doors. "Did you just say Aaron Hardy?" the judge asked, his tone perfectly level, but carrying the undeniable weight of a gavel about to strike wood. "Are you referring to the Aaron Hardy who authored the Hardy Risk Memorandum on Municipal Contractor Oversight?" The atmospheric pressure in the room plummeted in a fraction of a second. It was not a chaotic explosion. It was the terrifying, sudden vacuum that precedes a violent implosion. The clinking of silverware ceased completely. The string quartet in the corner abruptly halted mid-note. Every single eye in the vast dining room darted from the judge, to Graham, and finally, to me. Graham physically flinched. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his artificial tan looking sickly and gray in the chandelier light. He opened his mouth, his mind visibly racing to formulate a smooth pivot, a charming deflection, any combination of words that could shove the lid back onto the box he had just foolishly kicked open. He raised his hands in a placating gesture, preparing to speak. I did not give him the opportunity. I did not raise my voice, nor did I stand up from my marginalized seat. I simply looked directly at the federal judge, entirely ignoring my brother's panic, and delivered a single, unequivocal syllable. "Yes." Judge Whitcomb did not hesitate. He immediately pushed his heavy mahogany chair back and stood up to his full height. He completely ignored the rigid protocols of high society dining. He walked deliberately away from the place of honor at the center of the room and began navigating the maze of tables, heading straight for the shadowy perimeter. The wealthy guests parted before him like water. He stopped squarely in front of my small, isolated table. I stood up to meet him, keeping my posture impeccably straight. He extended his right hand. "It is an absolute honor to finally meet you in person, Ms. Hardy," he stated clearly, his voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "Your analytical framework regarding the manipulation of shell entities in civic procurement is nothing short of brilliant." I accepted his handshake. His grip was firm and conveyed genuine, unvarnished professional respect. "Thank you, Your Honor. The work is necessary." "It is vital," the judge corrected him. He then turned slightly, ensuring his voice reached the ears of every powerful person present. "Just last month, I utilized the exact risk assessment models you developed in a closed, highly classified forum on judicial ethics. I instructed 30 newly appointed federal magistrates on how to properly identify the exact mechanisms of corporate fraud using your direct methodologies. Your name is spoken with immense reverence in my chambers." I allowed my gaze to shift briefly toward the main table. Lila was sitting completely paralyzed. Her champagne flute was hovering inches from her mouth, her knuckles stark white against the crystal stem. The devastating reality was washing over her features in real time. She was looking at the man she was scheduled to marry, finally realizing that he had not merely hidden an awkward, socially inept relative. Graham had actively and maliciously concealed a woman of undeniable, verified substance. He had tried to bury a respected authority figure under the humiliating label of a minor administrative acquaintance. The sheer embarrassment of the lie was beginning to suffocate the room. From the far side of the dining hall, my mother, Diane, recognized the catastrophic collapse of the family facade. She practically sprinted across the hardwood floor, her heels clicking frantically in the terrible silence. She inserted herself directly between the judge and me. Her face stretched into a ghastly, terrified mask of maternal warmth. "Oh, Martin, please," Diane laughed, the sound brittle and entirely devoid of joy. She reached out to touch my arm, but I subtly shifted my weight, denying her the physical connection. Erin is simply so terribly modest. She absolutely despises flaunting her important government connections or her family ties at formal, celebratory gatherings. We try to respect her need to keep a low profile. It was a desperate, agonizing attempt at damage control. It was the exact kind of frantic social smoothing my mother had performed for my brother for 3 decades. But under the unforgiving, analytical stare of a federal judge, the lie did not hold. It simply highlighted the grotesque hypocrisy of the entire evening. Judge Whitcomb did not acknowledge my mother's frantic excuse. He did not even look at her. He kept his eyes locked entirely on me, his expression hardening into something exceptionally cold and terrifyingly clear. He processed the layout of the room, the distance from the head table, the freezing draft seeping through the glass doors. He turned his head slowly to look directly at Graham, who was still standing frozen at the head of the room, a panicked deer caught in the blinding headlights of reality. "If Ms. Hardy is so profoundly integral to the functioning of our civic integrity," the judge asked, his voice dropping to a soft, bone-chilling whisper that somehow echoed in every corner of the silent hall. "If she is, as you say, an acquaintance who merely handles the necessary details, why exactly has she been placed at a secondary overflow table situated by a drafty exit door?" The question hung in the air, a razor-sharp blade suspended by a single, fraying thread. Graham swallowed hard. The immaculate facade was entirely gone, replaced by the naked, desperate terror of a man whose central lie had just been dragged into the harsh light of day. He offered a weak, nauseatingly forced chuckle that sounded like tearing paper. "Well, you know," Graham stammered, his polished vocabulary abandoning him entirely. "Erin just deeply prefers her privacy. She asked to be seated somewhere quiet. It was her choice." He looked at me across the vast expanse of the dining room. His eyes were wide, silently begging me to save him. He was pleading with me to revert to the old, familiar family dynamic. He wanted me to fall on the sword, to absorb the humiliation, to validate his pathetic lie so he could survive the night. I looked back at him. I did not frown. I did not smile. I did not utter a single word of defense or accusation. I simply remained standing, maintaining the absolute, terrifying silence of a professional auditor who has just presented irrefutable evidence of fraud. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out for 10 agonizing seconds. My complete refusal to speak was the most violent action I could have possibly taken. In that perfectly weaponized silence, Graham's desperate lie found absolutely no purchase. It slid off me and crashed onto the polished mahogany floor for everyone to see. The entire power dynamic of the room had shifted, violently and irreversibly, without me ever having to raise my voice. The mine had detonated perfectly, right on schedule. The dinner dissolved with the awkward, rapid efficiency of a crime scene being quietly cordoned off. By 10 o'clock in the evening, the grand hall of the Belmere Society House was emptying at an alarming rate. Graham was stationed near the primary exit, his smile rigid and desperate as he attempted to intercept the departing guests. He was bleeding social capital by the second. Wealthy investors and political operatives, people who possessed a predatory instinct for a collapsing narrative, were suddenly finding urgent reasons to check their coats and summon their drivers. I did not wait for the room to entirely clear. I walked calmly toward the cloakroom, intending to retrieve my heavy winter coat and leave my brother to suffocate in the vacuum he had created. Before I could reach the heavy wooden doors, a soft voice called my name. I turned to find Lila Whitcomb stepping out of the shadows of the adjacent hallway. The geographical distance she had deliberately placed between herself and Graham spoke volumes. Earlier that evening, they had been a seamless, intertwined unit, physically touching at every opportunity to project the image of a perfect impending union. Now she stood entirely alone, her posture rigid, her expensive silk dress looking more like heavy armor than celebratory attire. The blind trust she had worn just 2 hours prior was completely shattered, replaced by the sharp, calculating wariness of a woman realizing she had been sleeping next to a stranger. She did not offer a polite preamble. She closed the distance between us, her eyes scanning the immediate area to ensure we were not being observed by my family. "I owe you a profound apology," Lila stated, her voice tight but remarkably steady. "But right now, I think you need to see this more than you need to hear me say I am sorry." She retrieved her phone from her small clutch purse, unlocked the screen, and handed the device directly to me. "Graham sent me this preliminary presentation deck 4 days ago," she explained, her tone dropping to a harsh whisper. "It is the core proposal for a new philanthropic venture he is launching. He calls it a civic integrity initiative. He is scheduled to present this to a private room of primary donors next Tuesday." I took the phone. The screen displayed a glossy, high-production slide deck. I swiped my thumb across the glass, moving past the title page and the vague, optimistic mission statements about community transparency. Then, I reached slide number 6. The air in my lungs immediately turned to ice. Staring back at me was my own name. It was not a casual mention. It was an entire biographical profile, meticulously formatted and aggressively weaponized. The slide listed my exact title at the Office of Civic Contracts Oversight. Below my name was a bulleted list of my professional achievements, but they had been heavily and dangerously manipulated. The text boldly claimed I was a primary consulting architect for this new initiative. Worse than the fabricated association was the intellectual theft. The next slide contained 3 large, bold quotes regarding the structural vulnerabilities in municipal procurement. I recognized the words instantly. They were pulled almost verbatim from a highly sensitive internal risk matrix I had authored 7 months ago. It was a document I had never released to the public. Graham had not merely researched my public profile. He had actively accessed stolen, proprietary government data to build his fraudulent pitch. My thumb hovered over the screen, trembling slightly with pure, unadulterated fury. I swiped to the next page. Slide number 8 identified the primary corporate partners for the initiative. Sitting at the very top of the list, presented as the shining example of corporate ethics and civic responsibility, was the Rowanvale Development Group. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the scheme snapped into perfect, terrifying focus. Graham was not merely embarrassed by my modest lifestyle or my lack of social grace. His demand that I remain completely anonymous tonight was not an act of simple snobbery. It was a desperate act of self-preservation. He was actively using the sterling, unblemished weight of my professional reputation as a federal auditor to artificially sanitize a massive real estate developer I was currently investigating for severe fraud. "He told me you were fully aware of this," Lila said, reading the cold horror settling over my features. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest. "He sat on my living room sofa 2 weeks ago and told me a deeply moving story. He claimed the two of you had experienced a severe falling out many years ago, that you were deeply eccentric and entirely estranged from the family. But he swore to me that you had privately given him your absolute blessing to utilize your compliance frameworks to better the city. He explicitly stated that you preferred to be an unofficial, silent backer because of your strict government role." I handed the phone back to her, my jaw locked tight. The truth was far more violent than the simple act of being shoved into a dark corner during dinner. Graham desperately wanted my physical self to be small, silent, and entirely invisible to his wealthy friends. But in the lucrative shadows, locked inside investor pitch meetings, he needed my name to be massive. He was selling my ghost to buy his own credibility. "None of that is true," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I have never seen this presentation. I have never authorized the use of my name or my internal agency documents. And Rowan Vale is currently the central target of a massive federal audit sitting on my desk." Lila closed her eyes, absorbing the massive, destructive weight of my words. When she opened them again, there were no tears. There was only the cold, hard pragmatism she had undoubtedly inherited from her father. She did not immediately declare the wedding canceled. She did not rush across the room to publicly confront Graham and cause a dramatic, screaming scene. That kind of emotional explosion was exactly what my brother was equipped to handle. He would easily spin a public argument into a story about two hysterical women misunderstanding a complex business arrangement. "I cannot just walk away tonight," Lila said, her gaze fixed on the polished marble floor. "If I call off a wedding of this magnitude without an airtight justification, he will completely control the narrative. He will systematically ruin my reputation to save his own. I need absolute proof. I need the documents, the money trail, the actual architecture of the lie. I need evidence. Aaron, you will have it," I promised her. She nodded once. "My father caught me in the coat room 10 minutes ago. He only knows a fraction of what is actually happening, but his instincts are rarely wrong. He warned me to step back carefully. He said that if Graham is attempting to blend judicial proximity, your specific federal oversight credibility, and private development capital into a single operation, the resulting fallout will not be a simple family tragedy. It will be a major federal indictment." We parted ways in the quiet hallway, two women bound not by impending sisterhood, but by a shared, silent declaration of war. I drove home through the quiet, freezing streets of the capital, my mind operating with the cold, ruthless efficiency of a machine. Graham had built his entire life on the assumption that I would always absorb his damage, that I would always prioritize the fragile illusion of family harmony over my own reality. He had severely miscalculated. It was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning when I unlocked the door to my apartment. I did not turn on the main overhead lights. I walked straight to my small dining table, opened my secure laptop, and connected to my encrypted personal email server. There was a single new message waiting in my inbox. The sender address was a complex string of randomly generated characters, heavily routed through multiple proxy servers to ensure complete anonymity. The subject line was completely blank. I opened the email. It contained no text, only a single attached document file. I ran the file through 3 separate security scans before cautiously opening it. It was a direct export from a private calendar application. It detailed a recurring, strictly confidential meeting scheduled for the first Tuesday of every single month for the past year. The attendees listed on the calendar invite were Graham Hardy, Rowan Vale, and a corporate entity I had never encountered before, Harbor Bridge Advisory. I stared at the name glowing on the bright screen in the dark room. It was the exact type of vague, meaningless corporate title utilized exclusively to hide the illicit movement of funds. It was the first solid, tangible door opening directly into the dark heart of my brother's fraudulent theater. He had tried to sell my shadow for his own profit, but he had entirely forgotten that shadows only exist when a very bright, unforgiving light is shining directly on the truth. I began typing the strange company name into my federal database search engine, ready to tear his entire structure down to the foundation. At 6 o'clock the following morning, the sky above the Capitol was the color of bruised iron. I did not wake up with the burning desire to scream, throw porcelain dishes, or demand tearful apologies. Anger is a remarkably inefficient fuel. It burns too hot and leaves nothing but ash. Discipline, however, is a cold, relentless engine. I arrived at the Office of Civic Contracts Oversight a full 2 hours before the standard administrative staff. The fluorescent lights flickered to life, illuminating the quiet sanctuary of the investigative floor. My first action was not an attack, but a meticulously calculated defense. I walked directly to the Internal Ethics Division and requested a formal review form. With absolute precision, I drafted a comprehensive disclosure report detailing the exact nature of the social contact I had experienced the previous evening. I formally documented the familial connection to the primary target of my ongoing federal audit. I preemptively requested a structural firewall, removing myself from any final voting authority on the contract approval, while maintaining my lead position in the data analysis and investigation phase. This was the impenetrable armor of modern bureaucracy. By willingly locking myself inside the strictest regulatory framework, I made it legally impossible for highly paid defense attorneys to later claim I was pursuing a personal vendetta or operating under a conflict of interest. I sanitized my own jurisdiction before I fired a single shot. Returning to the quiet solitude of my desk, I opened the encrypted files I had received during the early hours of the morning. I pulled the first thread provided by the anonymous calendar invitation: Harbor Bridge Advisory. It took me less than 3 hours navigating state corporate registry databases and comparing obscure tax filings to completely peel back the deceptive corporate veil. Harbor Bridge was an unregistered entity, a classic phantom company registered to a sterile post office box in a neighboring state. The registered executive agent was a junior partner at a subsidiary law firm frequently utilized by my brother and his elite image consulting agency. The architecture of the scheme was brilliant in its cowardice. Harbor Bridge was essentially a private, highly lucrative toll booth. My brother had established it specifically to act as an invisible conduit, connecting vulnerable political figures and influential members of the judiciary with massive real estate developers who desperately required a thick, expensive layer of public integrity. I initiated a secure query to review the preliminary banking metadata associated with the advisory firm. The financial transactions flowing steadily from the developer into Harbor Bridge were not structured in a way that screamed illegal bribery. There were no hidden offshore accounts or briefcases stuffed with unrecorded cash. Instead, the money moved in clean, regular installments. They were meticulously labeled as strategic civic alignment fees, community outreach retainers, and specialized public relations consulting. We were looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars categorized under the most vague, legally defensible terminology imaginable. It was exactly the kind of sophisticated, ambiguous money that was notoriously difficult to prosecute in a criminal courtroom. However, I knew from a decade of experience that this specific type of soft corruption was practically radioactive in the court of public opinion. If exposed to the harsh light of a federal inquiry, the sheer ethical rot of those invoices would instantly strangle a carefully manicured reputation to death. My next objective was proving the intellectual theft. I placed the promotional materials for the new philanthropic initiative side by side with my own secure internal archives. The civic proposal submitted by the developer utilized my precise risk assessment matrix almost entirely verbatim. This was no simple coincidence or shared industry terminology. The specific algorithms, the unique procedural phrasing, and the specialized vulnerability metrics belonged exclusively to my private drafts. Someone in my immediate bloodline had stolen them. I needed to document the exact point of the breach. I accessed the secure cloud backup of the family network drive. This was the same digital storage system I had painstakingly organized 7 years ago when I independently salvaged my parents from their catastrophic property tax disaster. Examining the administrative access logs from the past 6 months revealed a chilling systematic pattern. My brother had repeatedly accessed the drive, downloading gigabytes of archived personal data. But he had not acted alone in this violation. Digging deeper into the archived communication folders, I uncovered a deeply disturbing email thread between my brother and my mother. Diane had actively and enthusiastically participated in the mining of my identity. She had sent him dozens of old photographs, detailed snippets of my professional biography, and had even forwarded several of my old personal emails where I passionately discussed civic compliance theories. Her attached message stated cheerfully that she wanted to provide these materials to help him tell a much more compelling family story to his wealthy future relatives. My mother had happily provided the raw ammunition for my professional identity theft, completely unbothered by the severe boundary violation. The betrayal did not stop with her. In a subfolder labeled Community Outreach, I found a scanned document bearing my father's distinct, clumsy signature. Robert had signed a generic, glowing letter of social endorsement praising the visionary civic dedication of the developer. My father was entirely oblivious to the reality of the situation. He did not possess the intellectual capacity to understand that his signature, carrying our shared last name, was being actively weaponized as a formal character reference inside a multi-million-dollar fundraising portfolio designed to defraud the government. My parents had sold me out for the vague promise of social proximity to wealth. I opened a blank digital canvas on my secondary monitor and began constructing a massive, irrefutable timeline. I mapped every single event, ensuring the chronological data was accurate down to the exact day and hour. I charted the precise moment I was banished to the humiliating overflow table at the Georgetown dinner against the dates his shell company received its largest financial deposits. I tracked the day my mother eagerly forwarded my private correspondence against the exact day my specialized bureaucratic language suddenly appeared in the developer's sanitized corporate brochures. The timeline became a perfect, damning mirror of the entire deception. While I was being systematically erased and minimized in public, my professional ghost was being paraded in private boardrooms to legitimize massive corruption. The final, terrifying puzzle piece snapped into place when I compared the specific municipal project the developer was trying to secure using my stolen credentials. It was not merely a standard commercial real estate venture or a simple zoning variance. The pending contract was a massive federal requisition for comprehensive security and digital data infrastructure upgrades. The project encompassed 12 vital public buildings across the district. I sat back in my chair, the chill of the air conditioning suddenly biting through my clothes. If this fraudulent bid was successfully pushed through, backed by my brother's manufactured integrity and the stolen weight of my federal name, the consequences would be catastrophic. It was no longer just an embarrassing family betrayal or a petty social slight born of deeply rooted class insecurity. Handing a compromised, corrupt developer the master keys to the sensitive data networks of federal courthouses and regional tax offices was a massive, terrifying institutional vulnerability. My brother was playing a foolish game of social climbing, but he had accidentally unlocked the door to a severe national security risk. If I walked away now simply to keep the fragile peace at an impending wedding, if I chose the comfortable silence my family had always demanded of me, I would become an active accomplice. I would be endangering the very system I had sworn an oath to protect. I saved the timeline, encrypted the entire folder, and prepared to dismantle my brother's life not with screaming insults, but with the cold, crushing weight of undeniable paperwork. Lila Whitcomb did not spend the hours following the disastrous Georgetown dinner weeping into expensive silk pillows or demanding tearful explanations from her fiancé. She was, fundamentally, her father's daughter. She had been raised in a disciplined household where chaotic emotional outbursts were considered a severe tactical disadvantage. Instead of confronting Graham with wild accusations, She quietly and methodically began to audit the fundamental architecture of his entire existence. We met at a nondescript, poorly lit diner situated roughly 7 miles outside the affluent city center. It was a sterile, linoleum-floored establishment I specifically selected for its absolute lack of high society foot traffic. Lila arrived looking remarkably sharp, her posture rigid, her eyes completely devoid of the warm, trusting light I had witnessed just 48 hours prior. Sitting across from me in the cracked vinyl booth, she detailed the rapid unspooling of her reality. She explained that she had started her internal investigation by examining the mundane, everyday narratives Graham routinely fed her. She checked his casual anecdotes about where he purchased his morning coffee, the identity of his afternoon squash partners, and the highly specific reasons he gave for minor delays in his evening commute. She discovered that he lied about everything. He did not lie merely to cover up grand betrayals. He lied to artificially inflate his own perceived importance in every microscopic interaction. He lied the way a healthy person simply inhales oxygen. Once she recognized the pervasive rot in his daily dialogue, she turned her sharp intellect toward the substantive pillars of his professional life. For over a year, Graham had projected the polished, untouchable image of a man stationed at the absolute apex of his career. He had repeatedly assured Lila and her prominent family that he was merely weeks away from ascending to the senior executive leadership board at Fenwick Meridian Strategies. He spoke endlessly about exclusive equity shares and guiding the overarching vision of the firm. Lila utilized her own extensive network of corporate contacts to quietly verify his standing. The reality she uncovered was profoundly pathetic. Graham was permanently stalled at a mid-level tier within the agency. He was considered a useful, charming operative for client dinners, but he was entirely locked out of the true inner circle. He was completely dependent on older, more powerful partners to throw him lucrative scraps. He was not a kingmaker. He was an exceptionally well-dressed court jester. The financial reality of his existence proved to be even more grotesque. Preparing for their impending marriage, Lila possessed the legal authorization to access their newly established joint financial portals. Beneath several layers of carefully diverted digital statements, she unearthed a staggering personal deficit. My brother was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. He was actively floating this massive, suffocating liability on the sheer, glittering anticipation of their upcoming union. He was treating Lila's elite social pedigree and her father's entirely unblemished judicial reputation as tangible collateral to keep his aggressive creditors temporarily sedated. The most sickening discovery, however, was precisely how Graham weaponized the very concept of her father. Lila had managed to intercept a frantic, late-night voicemail left on Graham's secondary device by a highly nervous real estate investor. In the recording, the backer expressed deep hesitation about transferring funds to a new, vaguely defined corporate entity. My brother had explicitly and confidently promised this specific investor that his rapidly approaching status as the legal son-in-law of a sitting federal judge guaranteed absolute regulatory immunity. Graham was actively selling the terrifying illusion that marrying into the Whitcomb family provided an invisible, impenetrable shield against any future municipal oversight or federal prosecution regarding their questionable civic projects. We sat across from each other in the dim light of the diner. Two women who shared absolutely no common history, no warm, sisterly affection, and no overlapping social circles. We were bound together exclusively by a profound, cold disgust. We did not reach across the sticky table to hold hands. We did not exchange tearful, cinematic vows of eternal female solidarity. Our alliance was born of brutal, surgical necessity. We both violently rejected the humiliating roles my brother had arrogantly assigned to us. I absolutely refused to be utilized as his invisible, disposable stepping stone, and Lila absolutely refused to function as his pristine, decorative human shield. We were not friends, but we were a perfectly aligned tactical strike force. I asked her how Judge Whitcomb was navigating the unfolding crisis. I expected to hear that a man of his immense power was preparing to launch a biblical crusade to protect his only daughter. Lila shook her head. her expression reflecting a deep, inherited stoicism. She explained that her father offered no paternal rescue mission and absolutely no emotional coddling. When she had presented the judge with her initial portfolio of devastating findings, he did not rage, he did not raise his voice, and he did not promise to personally destroy Graham. He maintained the chilling, absolute detachment of a seasoned jurist presiding over a complex courtroom. He instructed Lila to immediately strip away her bruised ego, to look exclusively at the cold material facts laid out before her, and to allow the natural, devastating consequences of those facts to land exactly where they belonged. He explicitly stated that he would not intervene to save her from the intense public embarrassment of a suddenly canceled high society wedding. More importantly, he clarified that he would do absolutely nothing to shield my brother from the impending, catastrophic federal fallout of his own fraudulent actions. The judge demanded strict adherence to the truth, regardless of the collateral damage. Meanwhile, Graham possessed the desperate, erratic survival instincts of a cornered animal. He could clearly sense the tectonic plates shifting violently beneath his expensive Italian shoes. Lila had become strategically distant, answering his calls with brief, non-committal phrases. My own absolute silence following the Georgetown dinner was practically deafening, to secure his rapidly crumbling flanks. My brother ran straight back to the most reliable, historically proven source of his unchecked power. He ran directly to our parents. My personal phone rang continuously for 2 consecutive days. When I finally relented and answered the call, my mother's voice came through the speaker as a frantic, high-pitched weapon of emotional manipulation. She and my father had fully and eagerly swallowed Graham's preemptive, fabricated narrative. According to the desperate story my brother had spun, I was entirely consumed by a bitter, irrational, and deeply rooted jealousy. He had convinced our parents that I was purposefully attempting to sabotage his singular, shining chance at lifelong happiness simply because I was a cold, abrasive woman, completely incapable of holding on to a meaningful relationship of my own. My father eventually took the phone from her hands. His voice was heavy with a sickening, disappointed authority that made my stomach physically turn. He begged me, utilizing the full weight of his parental guilt, not to make a massive, destructive ordeal out of what he categorized as a simple, unfortunate seating arrangement and a few clumsy verbal misunderstandings. My parents aggressively demanded that I formally apologize to Graham for making the rehearsal dinner socially awkward. They were blindly pleading with me to use my own body, to protect his fragile, beautiful glass castle, completely and utterly unaware that he had purposefully built that very castle directly on top of a live, ticking minefield. I listened to their desperate pleas for 10 uninterrupted minutes. I did not raise my voice, I did not attempt to present my comprehensive evidence, and I did not bother trying to convince them of the profound danger they were in. They had made their permanent choice decades ago. I ended the phone call without offering a single concession or a single word of comfort. Exactly 5 minutes after I disconnected the call with my family, Lila sent me a secure, encrypted digital message. It contained a forwarded electronic invitation characterized by heavy, embossed graphics and exclusive access codes. Graham was not pulling back into the shadows to regroup. Driven by mounting financial panic and the terrifying realization that his absolute control was slipping, he was aggressively accelerating his timeline. He had scheduled one final, massive event to take place exactly 48 hours before the planned wedding ceremony. He was hosting an elite, highly exclusive donor salon at a heavily guarded private art gallery downtown. It was designed to be his final, desperate cash grab to bridge his suffocating debt before the marital vows permanently secured his social standing. According to the detailed agenda Lila had successfully intercepted, Graham was planning to use this specific salon to officially and publicly launch his fraudulent public integrity initiative. In front of a curated room packed entirely with wealthy, influential marks and prominent political figures, my brother intended to formally invoke my specific name, loudly broadcast my federal regulatory credentials, and openly present my stolen proprietary civic frameworks as his own brilliant creation. He was planning to do all of this entirely without my knowledge, without my presence, and absolutely without my legal consent. He genuinely believed that if he moved fast enough, if he spoke loudly enough in front of the right wealthy audience, he could successfully outrun the truth. He thought he was brilliantly orchestrating his ultimate triumph. He had absolutely no idea that Lila and I were already standing quietly at the end of his path, patiently waiting to hand him the shovel he would use to dig his own professional grave. At 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, exactly as I was finalizing the formal administrative injunction meant to officially block his philanthropic salon, the bureaucratic trap snapped violently shut on my own ankle. My brother did not simply wait to be exposed. He possessed a predatory instinct for public relations, and he struck first. A highly influential, widely circulated daily legal newsletter published a vicious blind item. The short, aggressively worded paragraph strongly insinuated that a senior auditor at my specific agency had recklessly and unethically discussed an active, highly sensitive federal financial investigation with the primary corporate targets during a private social gathering in Georgetown. Graham had brilliantly weaponized my mere physical presence at his rehearsal dinner. He transformed the very event he had forced me to attend into a poisoned blade aimed directly at my professional throat. The Internal Ethics Division, the exact same department I had proactively contacted to shield myself, was instantly bound by strict statutory mandates. They had absolutely no choice but to initiate an immediate, comprehensive internal review. My department director, a woman possessing a titanium spine but bound by rigid federal protocols, called me into a soundproof glass conference room. Until the internal inquiry reached a formal conclusion, I was placed on restricted communication status. I was legally barred from issuing any public statements. I was prohibited from contacting external municipal parties, and my ability to file any external injunctions was completely suspended. Graham had successfully gagged me. He utilized my own rigid adherence to procedural cleanliness to lock me inside a soundproof box. Believing he had effectively severed my vocal cords and neutralized his only legitimate threat, my brother saw his confidence metastasize into pure, unadulterated arrogance. He immediately and aggressively expanded the scope and scale of his upcoming donor salon. He upgraded the venue to a highly visible, incredibly expensive modern art space. He dispatched rush invitations to prominent photojournalists, key political commentators, and high-net-worth civic figures across the Capitol. He felt utterly invincible. He truly believed he had outsmarted a federal auditor by manipulating the notoriously slow gears of government bureaucracy. The sheer blinding scale of his renewed confidence caused a brief but terrifying fracture in Lila and her resolve. We met for exactly 15 minutes in the freezing subterranean parking garage beneath her architectural firm. She looked completely exhausted, the dark circles under her eyes betraying her pristine posture. Her previous composure was visibly cracking. Graham had spent the entire previous 24 hours weeping on her living room sofa, playing the role of the devastated, deeply misunderstood romantic hero with terrifying perfection. He spun a masterful, agonizing narrative about a rigid, vindictive sister who was desperately trying to destroy his happiness out of sheer, pathological spite. His performance was emotionally devastating. He begged Lila to trust his vision, swearing on his life that his public integrity initiative was a genuine attempt to heal the fractured world. Compounding her dangerous hesitation was the suffocating, quiet pressure applied by Rowan Vale. The ruthless developer had cornered her at a charity luncheon earlier that afternoon. He did not yell or issue overt threats. Instead, he utilized the soft, menacing vocabulary of high finance. He heavily implied that any sudden marital disruption or public scandal right before the official announcement would severely derail massive lines of credit and vital municipal approvals. Vile made it chillingly clear that Lila, holding on to her hesitation, was currently threatening hundreds of millions of dollars in highly leveraged investments. The burden of destroying a massive economic ecosystem was suddenly resting squarely on her shoulders. I listened to her voice shake in the echoing concrete garage, but I did not offer her emotional platitudes. I could not act based on righteous fury. Panic and anger are the desperate refuges of the unprepared. I needed to demonstrate the cold, undeniable gravity of disciplined intellect. I told Lila to hold her ground for 48 more hours, and then I walked away. Returning to my isolated desk, I meticulously compiled every single piece of evidence I had painstakingly gathered. I packaged the exact timeline, the server access logs, the stolen proprietary oversight algorithms, and the obscure financial tracking data connecting the shell company to the developer. I placed all of it into a heavily encrypted, tamper-proof digital vault. I officially and voluntarily surrendered the entire comprehensive package directly to the internal review board investigating me. I willingly handed over all my ammunition to the federal investigators, placing my absolute trust in the unassailable purity of the evidence chain rather than relying on my own restricted voice. I knew the investigators would instantly recognize the fraudulent nature of the leaked newsletter item the moment they reviewed my precise timeline. Then, the magnificent architecture of my brother and his grand deception collapsed entirely from the inside. At exactly 9 o'clock that evening, I heard a frantic, repeated knocking on my apartment door. Standing in the dimly lit hallway was a young, visibly terrified man wearing a rumpled gray suit. It was my brother and his junior executive assistant. He was the elusive originator of the anonymous encrypted emails I had received days prior. As Graham recklessly accelerated the expansion of the fraudulent salon, the young assistant realized he was perfectly positioned by human resources to be the ultimate, disposable scapegoat when the federal indictments inevitably dropped from the sky. His basic survival instinct violently overpowered his corporate loyalty. I led him inside. The assistant sat at my small kitchen table, his hands trembling violently as he placed a small, silver digital audio recorder onto the wood surface. He explained, his voice cracking, that he was routinely instructed to record private strategy sessions in order to draft highly accurate meeting minutes for the firm. He had quietly kept a backup file from a deeply restricted meeting that took place 3 weeks ago. I pressed the play button. Through the tiny metallic speaker, my brother and his voice echoed loudly in my quiet apartment. He was not delivering a polished public relations pitch. He was not performing the role of the wounded, misunderstood sibling. He was laughing. It was a cruel, arrogant, deeply ugly sound. I sat perfectly still as I listened to him explicitly lay out his entire master plan to a closed room of nervous, wealthy investors. His recorded words were devastatingly clear and completely devoid of any moral ambiguity. He boasted loudly, his tone dripping with supreme condescension. He explicitly told the room that possessing a father-in-law who is a sitting federal judge, combined with a sister who holds a highly credible government oversight title, was absolutely enough to clean up any dirty contract in the entire district. He laughed again, calling us his two most valuable, oblivious human shields. I stopped the recording. The silence in my kitchen was absolute. For the very first time since this entire nightmare began, I possessed something infinitely more lethal than a mismatched corporate spreadsheet or a illegally copied internal document. I held his genuine, unfiltered intent. I had the precise, undeniable audio of his malice. Complex financial documents could potentially be debated or deliberately obscured by incredibly clever defense attorneys. But a man loudly and joyfully bragging on tape about actively corrupting the federal judiciary and maliciously exploiting his own bloodline for immense financial gain was a fatal, unrecoverable wound. Graham believed he had effectively silenced me in the public sphere by utilizing a cheap media trick. He had absolutely no idea that his own terrifying arrogance had just handed me the exact, perfect weapon required to execute his pristine reputation in the private one. I looked at the trembling assistant, thanked him for his profound courage, and began preparing for the final phase of the audit. The donor salon took place on a Thursday evening inside a sprawling, minimalist modern art gallery downtown. The venue was a massive cavern of pristine white walls, polished concrete floors, and bizarre, towering abstract sculptures constructed from twisted scrap metal. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive catering and the low, constant hum of extreme wealth. Graham was stationed near the center of the room, holding court with a terrifying, practiced ease. He had completely abandoned the panicked, defensive posture he displayed earlier in the week. Instead, he was performing a flawlessly calibrated version of the deeply apologetic, tragically misunderstood brother. He moved smoothly between small clusters of wavering investors and influential civic leaders, his voice dropping to a theatrical, sorrowful register. He actively spun a narrative of profound family tragedy, portraying himself as a patient man trying desperately to save a sister who was consumed by irrational bitterness and professional jealousy. His performance was incredibly effective. Several prominent guests cast subtle, judging glances in my direction, their eyes filled with a mixture of elite pity and polite disgust. They bought his manufactured reality completely, leaving me isolated on the edges of the room, looking exactly like the vindictive, unstable woman he claimed I was. Eventually, he broke away from his admiring audience and deliberately cornered me near a massive, sound-absorbing installation far away from the busy bar. The moment we were out of the public eye, the sorrowful, patient mask dissolved instantly. He did not offer a single word of genuine apology for leaking the defamatory article to the legal press or for explicitly stealing my internal agency documents. He leaned his tall frame toward me, invading my physical space, and his voice dropped to a harsh, demanding hiss. He ordered me to drop my investigation immediately and keep my mouth completely shut. He invoked the fragile health and social standing of our parents, insisting that my stubborn refusal to play along would permanently destroy their twilight years. Then, he delivered a thinly veiled, incredibly precise threat. He promised me that if I dared to disrupt his impending marital union or publicly expose his philanthropic initiative, he would leverage every single contact at his image consulting firm to ensure my professional reputation was systematically annihilated. He promised to make my name so incredibly toxic that I would never work in federal oversight again, before I could formulate a clinical response to his threat. My parents materialized from the crowded floor. Diane and Robert had been anxiously tracking our interaction from across the room. My mother approached with her hands fluttering nervously, her face stretched into a tight, panicked mask. I looked directly into her eyes and demanded to know if she had been fully aware of his plan to humiliate and hide me at the rehearsal dinner from the very beginning. I needed to hear the absolute truth directly from her own mouth. Diane did not blink, nor did she attempt to deny it. She blurted out her justification with a casual, thoughtless cruelty that felt exactly like a physical blow to the chest. She admitted she knew everything about the seating arrangement and the strict instructions regarding my identity. She smoothed the front of her tailored evening dress and stated, in a voice completely devoid of maternal warmth, that in rooms filled with powerful, wealthy individuals, a woman who is too sharp, too rigid, and too intelligent simply makes important men feel incredibly uncomfortable. She explicitly told me that Graham desperately needed a soft, agreeable background to shine against, not a difficult sister who constantly challenged the natural social order. That single terrible sentence unlocked decades of buried trauma. The most agonizing realization was not simply that my mother blatantly favored my brother. It was the horrifying, undeniable truth that she had actively and intentionally trained me to shrink my entire existence. She had spent my entire life teaching me to quietly fold myself into a tiny, invisible, deeply compliant shape solely to ensure the men in our family could expand their egos and feel completely at ease. She had groomed me to be a sacrificial lamb on the altar of male comfort. As I stood there absorbing the sheer magnitude of my mother and her betrayal, my father stepped forward. Robert looked old, frail, and absolutely terrified under the harsh gallery lights. His hands were shaking as he confessed the final, catastrophic piece of their shared delusion. He admitted, his voice cracking with immense shame, that he had secretly visited a bank 3 months ago and taken out a massive second mortgage on their family home. He had quietly handed every single dollar of that substantial loan directly to Graham to help float my brother and his suffocating, hidden personal debts. Robert looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, stating that he truly believed this elite wedding and the immense social capital it guaranteed would immediately open up a future lucrative enough to easily fill all their current financial sinkholes. The reality of their situation was breathtaking in its sheer stupidity. They had literally wagered the roof over their own heads, their entire financial safety net, on my brother and his ability to successfully execute a massive social and financial fraud. A sudden, sharp intake of breath shattered the heavy, suffocating silence of our private corner. I turned my head slightly. Lila Whitcomb was standing absolutely still behind a freestanding marble pillar just 3 feet away. She had stepped away from the main party to find a quiet moment of respite and had accidentally walked directly into the raw, unfiltered, devastating truth. Lila stared at the 3 members of my family. Her face was a perfect mask of pure, crystalline realization. She finally, completely understood that her impending marriage possessed absolutely nothing to do with genuine love, mutual respect, or even the preservation of high society face. Her entire romantic relationship had been cynically and ruthlessly reduced to a tangible financial asset. She realized she was merely the required collateral designed to secure a desperate, reckless game of social speculation. She did not scream. She did not shed a single tear. She did not say a single word to Graham. She simply turned around and walked silently back into the crowded gallery, leaving a terrifying, absolute void in her wake. Looking back at my parents, seeing the naked terror and pathetic desperation etched deeply into their aging faces, a deeply ingrained, sickeningly familiar instinct flared up inside my chest. It was the exact same overwhelming urge I had felt 7 years ago when I drained my hard-earned retirement accounts to save their house from the tax collectors. The lifelong, deeply conditioned habit of swallowing my own dignity, suppressing my own rage, and absorbing their toxic mistakes just to keep the fragile family unit intact screamed at me to surrender. I knew I could easily walk away right now. I could shred my investigative files, drop the federal audit, smile for the wedding photographers, and let them all survive another day living inside their comfortable lies. But I looked at Graham. I saw the smug, triumphant certainty slowly returning to his eyes as he watched me hesitate. He genuinely believed his cruel emotional manipulation had worked once again. And in that exact fraction of a second, the old subservient habit died instantly and permanently. I finally understood that offering my absolute silence tonight was no longer an act of familial kindness or loyalty. My silence would be an act of active, undeniable complicity in a massive federal crime. Covering for them meant becoming exactly like them. I did not argue. I did not threaten them in return. I simply turned my back on my blood relatives and walked out of the art gallery, leaving them alone with their collapsing house of cards. The following morning, I arrived at my office to find a formal, heavily encrypted email waiting in my inbox from the director of my agency. The rigorous internal review regarding my alleged ethical breach had officially concluded. The ethics board had meticulously scrutinized every single document I provided, cross-referenced the time-stamped access logs, and carefully reviewed my initial proactive disclosure forms. Because I had strictly adhered to federal protocol and formally reported the hostile social contact from the very first minute, the board completely exonerated me. The communication restrictions were immediately and permanently lifted. My professional blade was sharp, polished, and completely unrestricted. I picked up my secure desk phone and initiated a sequence of highly coordinated, aggressive calls. I did not focus my energy on the lavish wedding ceremony scheduled for the upcoming weekend. I focused entirely on the massive financial deposits, the compromised real estate developer, and the municipal contracts waiting to be fraudulently signed. By 10 o'clock that morning, an emergency ethics and compliance meeting was formally convened. The mandatory gathering was scheduled to take place at the Belmere Civic Foundation headquarters, exactly 24 hours before the final, massive, non-refundable wedding deposits were scheduled to be released by the Whitcomb Family Trust. Official, legally binding summons were issued to every single stakeholder actively involved in the corrupt ecosystem. Across the city, Graham was currently busy at a luxury boutique, smiling brightly as he picked up his expensive custom tuxedo. He was blissfully unaware of the massive storm gathering directly over his head. He firmly believed he had successfully bullied his sister into permanent submission, secured his wealthy, beautiful bride, and finalized the foundation for his fraudulent philanthropic empire. He had absolutely no idea that when he walked into that boardroom the next day, he would not be stepping into a final, celebratory wedding consultation. He was about to walk completely blind into the most brutal, unforgiving, and utterly destructive trial of his entire life. The setting was no longer a dimly lit corner of a lavish dining hall. The climax of my brother's meticulously constructed life took place inside the austere, soundproofed executive boardroom of the Belmere Civic Foundation. It was exactly 2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, mere hours before the final. Non-refundable vendor deposits for the wedding were scheduled to clear, and the philanthropic funding agreements were meant to be legally bound. The heavy mahogany table was fully occupied. I sat at the far end, flanked by 2 senior ethics compliance officers from the Office of Civic Contracts Oversight. Across from me sat a grim-faced senior managing partner from Fenwick Meridian Strategies. To his left was Rowan Vale, his usual predatory relaxation replaced by a rigid, guarded posture. At the head of the table sat Judge Martin Whitcomb and his daughter, Lila. Graham entered the room 5 minutes late, flanked by our parents. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, a brilliant, confident smile plastered across his face. He clearly believed he was walking into a final, celebratory, logistical briefing to rubber stamp his funding initiative. The moment the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind him, the suffocating gravity of the room finally registered in his eyes. His smile faltered, dropping completely when he saw the federal ethics officers sitting rigidly beside me. I did not raise my voice. I did not display a single ounce of anger, triumph, or familial sorrow. I operated with the cold, absolute precision of a forensic auditor presenting a terminal diagnosis. I opened the thick indexed binder resting on the table before me and began to dismantle his existence piece by piece. I presented the evidence in a strictly chronological, emotionless sequence. I started with printed copies of his text messages, explicitly demanding I hide my identity and my federal jurisdiction from the judge. I submitted the seating charts from the Georgetown dinner, demonstrating the physical manifestation of that concealment. I then distributed high-resolution copies of his philanthropic slide deck, forcing everyone at the table to look at my stolen name and the heavily manipulated biography he used to sell his integrity initiative. I laid out the server access logs, proving exactly when he and my mother had mined my private files. I presented the glowing letter of social endorsement signed by my father, immediately following it with the financial routing numbers that proved how that very letter was being used to legitimize a corrupt development bid. Finally, I distributed the bank records for Harbor Bridge Advisory, detailing the hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing from the developer into his phantom consulting firm. Graham sat completely paralyzed. He opened his mouth a dozen times to launch a charming defense, to spin a desperate lie, but the sheer, suffocating volume of the paper trail choked the words in his throat. My parents stared at the documents spread across the polished wood, the color draining entirely from their faces as they realized the full, criminal scope of what they had blindly supported. Then, I reached the final item. I placed the silver digital audio recorder on the center of the table and pressed the play button. The pristine acoustics of the boardroom amplified the recording perfectly. Every single person in the room listened to my brother's cruel, arrogant laughter. They heard his exact, unfiltered voice boasting about utilizing his future father-in-law, a sitting federal judge, and his sister, a credible government auditor, to easily launder dirty municipal contracts. The recording was a masterclass in profound hubris. It was the undeniable sound of a man who believed other human beings were nothing more than disposable tools designed for his personal enrichment. The audio clicked off. The resulting silence in the room was absolute and terrifying. Rowan Vale was the very first to move. He was a creature of pure, ruthless self-preservation. Recognizing the massive, radioactive legal exposure radiating from the center of the table, the developer stood up and buttoned his jacket. He looked directly at the federal ethics officers and explicitly stated that his corporation was completely severing all ties with Graham Hardy and the proposed initiative. He announced that all pending financial transfers through Harbor Bridge Advisory were permanently frozen, pending a full internal and federal review. He walked out of the room without ever looking back at my brother. The senior partner from Fennec Meridian Strategies did not even bother to stand up. He looked at Graham with an expression of profound professional disgust. In a voice as dry as dust, he informed my brother that his employment was terminated, effective immediately. He cited gross violations of corporate ethics, the deliberate concealment of massive conflicts of interest, and the catastrophic damage inflicted upon the reputation of the firm. Graham was stripped of his title, his income, and his entire professional identity in less than 30 seconds. Lila Whitcomb remained seated beside her father. She did not weep, and she did not scream at the man she was supposed to marry the following day. She simply reached across the table and placed her brilliant, flawless diamond engagement ring softly onto the mahogany surface. She took it off not out of a fleeting sense of social embarrassment, but because she finally saw the absolute, terrifying core of his character. She looked at Graham and told him that she finally understood his fundamental flaw. He was a man who desperately needed the women around him to be small, silent, and compliant, simply because it was the only possible way he could ever trick himself into feeling big. Judge Whitcomb did not erupt into a rage. He did not threaten to use his immense judicial power to crush my brother into dust. He possessed a terrifying, measured authority that required no theatrics. He simply looked at the ruined man sitting across from him and delivered a sentence that sealed the room like the heavy lid of a coffin. "The most dangerous thing in this world is not raw ambition," the judge said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding register. "It is the specific type of pathetic ambition that must be constantly fed by degrading one's own family." At the far end of the table, the devastating reality finally crashed down upon my parents. Diane and Robert realized simultaneously that they were not merely losing an elite society wedding, their newly manufactured reputation, and their proximity to immense power. They realized, with a suffocating, physical horror, that the massive second mortgage they had secretly taken out to fund my brother and his mountain of debt was now completely unpayable. They had literally gambled their family home on a future constructed entirely from fragile, malicious lies, and they had lost everything. My mother looked across the long table at me. Her eyes were wide, brimming with a desperate, pathetic pleading. She was silently begging me to revert to my lifelong role. She wanted me to step in, to offer my savings, to provide my silence, to somehow fix the catastrophic mess they had engineered. I looked back at her, and then at my father. I felt absolutely nothing. The deep, agonizing well of familial obligation that had dictated my entire existence was completely dry. I refused to save them. I would not offer them a single dollar, and I would no longer offer them the comfortable, subservient silence they had demanded of me for 37 years. I closed my binder and stood up. I did not offer a closing statement or a dramatic farewell. The final, defining image of the entire ordeal required no words at all. I turned and walked out of the boardroom in absolute, perfect quiet. Behind me, I left Graham sitting completely paralyzed amidst a mountain of damning paperwork. He was surrounded by the backs of people walking away from him, a discarded engagement ring, a shattered career, and the absolute destruction of his financial future. It was the bitterest, most agonizing lesson of his entire life. The exact person he had tried so desperately to push into the shadows, the sister he had worked so hard to hide away, turned out to be the only person in the world who possessed the unyielding integrity, the legal authority, and the undeniable evidence required to bring his entire fraudulent empire crashing to the ground. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please leave a comment below to interact and share your thoughts with everyone. Subscribe to the Daisy Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.